we'll do some introductions real quick. Just panelists, we'll have you give your name and a little bit about your background, and then we'll get to the part that everyone's looking forward to with questions. So Carly, I will start with you.
All right. Well, hi everybody. My name is Carly. I currently work as a registered dietitian at the Cleveland Clinic. I have dual appointments in orthopedics, sports medicine at the clinic, and then I also work in our general clinics. From my sports perspective, I work with Kent State University, Cleveland State University, and John Carroll University. I completed my undergraduate degree at Kent State University in nutrition and dietetics and also exercise science. And then I completed my graduate degree and my dietetic internship at Bowling Green State University.
Awesome. Thank you for joining us, Carly. Jean, I'll go to you next.
Hi, everybody. I'm Jean Stevenson. I'm a registered dietitian and a board certified specialist in sports dietetics. And I am currently working with student athletes at University of Detroit Mercy. I also teach sports nutrition. I've worked with professional athletes, formerly the MLB team here in Detroit, and Detroit Lions a little bit, and so a variety of different athletes.
Great. Thanks for joining us. And last but not least, Madison.
Hi everyone, I'm Madison. I am the sports dietitian at Oakland University. I also teach a couple classes there in the nutrition department. And then prior to that, I went to school at the University of Florida, where I played soccer and then also studied dietetics, got my undergrad and graduate degree from there, and then now moved back up to Michigan.
Awesome. Thank you for being here. So yeah, we'll just get started right in with some questions. And like I said, if you have a question, please feel free to drop it in the Q&A. Looks like we've got quite a few participants and some teams, I think, on. So it should be interesting for everyone. So the first question, I feel like we kind of need to start sort of big with maybe understanding a little bit more about what nutrients are and nutrition and all of that. So the first question I actually had was, so what's the difference between micronutrients and macronutrients? And Jean, I think maybe we'll start with you on this one.
Okay, well, macronutrients, I think everybody's familiar with these, carbohydrate, protein, and fat. And we need them in large amounts and we measure them in grams. Micronutrients are vitamins and minerals, and we need them in much smaller amounts, and they're measured in micrograms. So I don't know, does that help answer the question?
I think so, yeah. So where would we look for those things? Like, is there food groups that some of those are more common in than others? Like,
Right. So if you're talking about the macronutrients, let's start with carbohydrate. And they would be found in all kinds of different foods, pasta, bread, um, grains, beans, fruits, vegetables. Dairy has carbohydrate. So very widely found in our diet. And then the protein is found in animal type products like chicken, turkey, fish, dairy products like milk, yogurt, cheese, and plant foods that are high in protein are beans, legumes, and soy products, things like that. And then fat comes in a lot of different sources, whether they're animal sources or plant sources, but things like vegetable oils and mayonnaise, salad dressings, avocado, nuts, and seeds are sources of fat in our diet.
I would just
so,
piggyback off of that and say that our macros, our macronutrients are going to be our energy type foods. So with my athletes, I talk a lot about making sure we have enough macronutrients, especially on those hard workout days. Although you need them on all the days, but the micronutrients, like Jean mentioned, is our fruits and veggies, our vitamins and minerals, less energy dense type foods, but still very important for the body.
awesome. And I know one of the questions, like a lot of our student athletes have, obviously, right, they work with you all on campuses, right, nutritionists, those types of things. But one of the things that they've really, we've gotten a lot of questions about is what happens when I stop being a student athlete? So I think they probably know a lot, right, about sort of how to fuel their bodies game day, right? Sometimes that's not even in their control, right? Coach picks the pregame meal or whoever. So how does their sort of nutrient needs change sort of once they're done competing and are like normal people again, not, burning all that energy all the time. How do their needs sort of change in that nutrient level? I don't, and whoever wants to answer that.
Well, one of the factors that we would take into account is how much physical activity will they be doing after their college sports career. So that would vary, from individual to individual. They may still maintain a very high level of physical activity and their calorie needs may not change much. And then on the other hand, maybe they join the workforce and they have a sedentary position where they're mostly sitting at a desk all day and their calorie needs might change a lot at that point where they need a lot less. So sometimes there's a bit of a transition as they transition from a full-time job of physical activity, so to speak, to a job where they're sitting more and maybe not needing as many calories.
I think this also gives athletes or post athletes an opportunity to really get to know themselves too. I mean, what a great opportunity to actually find out what foods you like versus maybe the ones that, yeah, coaches bringing in or some of the teams are bringing in for you. And then as Jean mentioned too, what physical activity means to you as well. Some athletes, really want that competitiveness for the rest of their life, and that's great. That's great if you want to continue that activity, but maybe it comes to the point where, activity is a lot more stress for them in that college scene. So what does that look like for them going forward? That dictates what their nutrition might look like a little bit more.
Yeah. And I think that kind of leads into one of the other questions. So even if you're staying active right after you're done with your collegiate career, it's still probably not going to be at the same level that you are as an athlete, as a student athlete, right? It's not the 20 hours a week. It's not all of that kind of stuff. So what are some strategies to avoid maybe some of that possible weight gain or loss or whatever it might look like when you are sort of on a different activity level, right? So, Madison, if you want to start maybe with that one.
Sure, yeah. So I think the main things that come to my mind, if we still focus on our macros and micros, we can actually reduce our carbohydrate intake a little bit when we're doing less physical activity and increase those micronutrients. So the colorful things on our plates, we can have more smoothies and salads and things that, again, potentially weren't the best option at the time when you were really in high intense situations. Another thing I think just overall general nutrition advice is to try to cook more at home, choose whole foods, lean towards the lean proteins, whole grains. I think those are like the magic words as a dietitian is to try to lean towards those things at the grocery store where you actually have to physically cut up and cook and make on your own.
Yeah. Is there anything particular, obviously our student athletes are building a lot of muscle mass, right? They've really are in good physical health. Are there ways, specific foods or nutrients that they really should be focusing on to sort of keep that overall healthy level that they probably have coming out of that collegiate career? Okay. I don't
I
know
think
who
again,
was.
it depends on their physical activity. So if their physical activity remains high, their diet may be very similar. But I think that Madison made a good point is they might not need as much carbohydrate if their physical activity is a little bit lower. And it's going to be the physical activity, the exercise, the resistance training that's going to help them maintain their muscle, as well as getting a balance of all the nutrients, including protein.
Sometimes too, transitioning from, a high intensity exercise to maybe something a little bit more moderate. That still means that you have to fuel adequately. That doesn't give you an excuse to skip meals or, not have those things still throughout the course of the day. So planning ahead for what that looks like is still an important role.
Yeah. And I think that's one of those things that I've heard too talk about that, because your eating habits are changing and your activity is changing, that sometimes that can lead into sometimes developing different sort of eating disorders or disordered eating, however you want to say that. What are sort of those different types of sort of the eating disorders and that maybe you see more in former student athletes, right? Because I know, right, that's such a big shift that sometimes that can lead to that.
Carly, did you want to take this one or do you
I
want?
was going to say, I'll start off with this one because there's a few things I wanted to mention too. So, when we think about eating disorders and disordered eating, the terminology is actually a little bit different. So, disordered eating, it might present itself as some of those factors that we might see as far as, skipping meals, whether that's intentional or unintentional. It could include, dieting to some extent, binge eating, but it doesn't have these certain criteria that we need to meet to be considered an actual eating disorder. So I think, depending on certain populations, and especially if we're looking at a group of athletes that might have or might be in a sport that is more weight-based, some of those things we start to see develop in that sport, some of those thoughts around eating. And I think along with this, I know we could probably talk about social media and the role of that as far as nutrition, probably the rest of the night as well. But, with our athletes, that's something that's going to continue to be very prominent as far as that social media role. So I think in my practice, there's different types of eating disorders that I see, actually those actual diagnoses is like anorexia. I do see some binge eating. So I think forming that relationship with food and starting to have that conversation as far as, is this something that you want to heal? What do we want this to look like going forward? I think one of the questions that I pose to my athletes is, wouldn't it be so awesome to not think about this all the time? You'd probably have a lot less stress throughout the day. So how can we work towards that being more of a positive relationship and just kind of starting that conversation?
Yeah. Say, Madison, Jean, anything to add to that?
I would say, I think the transition away from sports, like you mentioned, can kind of increase that risk of getting some sort of disordered eating or even an eating disorder. I think having the conversation, like with a dietitian, of like, okay, my needs are changing. How do I know how to fuel myself so that I'm not gaining 40 pounds after I stop, or losing all this muscle that I put on, or losing the cardiovascular fitness? And it's finding ways to still enjoy your fitness and not feel like you're having to kill yourself every time you go for a run or do sprints every Monday at 6 a.m. Like you don't have to do that anymore. And so maybe it's finding, I talk a lot about like joyful movement of like going rollerblading with your friends or going for a walk or a hike. Like you can do that now that you're not an athlete. And so along with finding that good relationship with food, I think it's finding a good relationship with exercise. And then the third piece is finding a good relationship with your body and understanding that it's going to change. Most likely, it's going to change from when you're an athlete to when you're not. And so understanding that that's a piece of it and then not having that be the main focus when you're done, just like the question of wouldn't you love to not think about food all the time? Same thing as wouldn't you love to not think about your body all the time as well.
Yeah. Yeah. So
I
yeah,
also
you,
think,
Oh, go ahead.
I was going to say that it's important also, if it's somewhat of a struggle for somebody to seek out the advice of a professional. And I think nutrition information is so prevalent everywhere, especially social media. And sometimes, if that's where people are getting their information, are they really getting the information that's going to help them? Who is this person that is advising people about maybe topics that they're not really trained to? And so, I think that's the great part of our role, is that we're on campus, we're able to help, we're able to be sort of the voice of reason when these things come up. And I'll just share that I had a student athlete once that was, I think, struggling and getting her information. And when I sat down to meet with her, she told me that I need 1,200 calories a day. And I thought it was very interesting. And I said, well, based on what? And she said, oh, I use this app and I put all my information in, and this is what I found out. And I said, but your full-time job is physical activity. And 1,200 calories might be appropriate for your classmate who's not a student athlete and may not even be exercising and put into the app that she wanted to lose weight. When that's not the same situation as you, that wasn't meant for you, that information. So let's talk a little bit about what would be more appropriate. So without the advice of somebody who maybe it's the athletic trainer before we actually get to meet with them, I think that there's so much misinformation that could steer our athletes a little bit wrong in the wrong path.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, and I would say, yeah, and staying active, that's all good. The idea of going out and movement for joy, right? Finding the things that, I said you could go out and do the walk with the podcast in your ear instead of coach in your ear. No offense to the coaches that might be on this call, but I'm sure the podcast is more enjoyable. But yeah, I mean, so we talked a lot about, some of the changes that you can have post athletics with your food, but we also know that sometimes you might have an injury, right? So I think one of the questions we had gotten was advice about preventing or managing injuries that might occur as part of your sport through sort of nutrition recovery practices and those types of things. So is there advice that you can give sort of how they can handle that injury if it happens or prevent it from happening? I think Carly, I
Yeah.
don't know if you want to start there.
Yeah. So I think as far as injury prevention, I think sometimes the role of the dietitian tends to get a little bit lost. And I always find, and I'm sure Gina and Madison would agree with me, is we tend to advocate a lot for ourselves to be in that situation or that role as far as helping the athlete with injury, because nutrition can play a huge role in that. I think from an injury prevention standpoint, kind of piggybacking on some things that Jean had said is, providing that education. Because many times it does come down to, an athlete just doesn't know how much they actually need throughout the course of the day and what nutrition might look like for them. And, we're looking at dietary preferences and what's available. If we're talking to someone who's living in a dorm, for example, or maybe they're living at home right now, what resources are available in terms of, getting nutrition to them. So I think from a pre-op perspective, making sure that you're getting an adequate balance of some of these nutrients. Carbohydrates are still used for energy. Especially when we're going into a surgery, it's very important that you're still having that energy source so our bodies don't have to pull from muscle sources. We're not at risk of losing some of that lean body mass. And after injury or after surgery, recovering appropriately, whether that's including appropriate protein sources or again, trying to get in some of those micronutrients that we're talking about, some of those fat soluble vitamins or some of our B vitamins, even to kind of bridge these gaps. So again, I think from a surgical standpoint, planning ahead as far as what nutrition can look like, but also being in contact as far as, students and athletes still talking with their athletic trainers. How can I get back to doing what I love to do? And how can nutrition help me? How can physical therapy help me? How can these other avenues help me?
Yeah. Gene or Madison, anything to add to that?
One of the things that I would add is I think that sometimes there's a misconception when somebody has an injury that I'm not as physically active as I normally am, so I'm going to cut way back on my eating. And then they're actually losing weight when in reality, for recovery, they may need additional calories and additional protein, so more fuel to help that recovery. So I think clearing up the misconception when we hear those types of things from athletes can be really beneficial to them and their recovery process.
Yeah, definitely. That's good advice. So we know one of the things, obviously, that anytime you have an injury or even what we've been talking about, sort of this transition out of the student athlete life, you're focused on your nutrition and the things, the weight loss and the staying active, but obviously there's an impact on your mental health as well. So are there ways to sort of deal with sort of the psychological or emotional aspects of sort of making that transition out of this high level athletic environment into, again, sort of what I'll term just normal life, and how that may have an impact sort of on your eating habits and those types of things. So I think Madison, I don't know if you want to start with that one.
Yeah, so this happened to me fairly recently when I stopped playing soccer. I felt like, okay, now what do I do? And it's challenging because I'd never really had to think about it until it happened. And then you're really questioning kind of like what you like to do with your free time, what you should be doing, how busy you need to be, etc. So from a nutrition standpoint, I would say I'm probably a little biased because I was studying nutrition, but I took the time to like really enjoy cooking, finding new recipes, kind of being able to actually like enjoy my food rather than just scarfing it down as fast as I can before a game. And really like leaning into like the taste and the flavors and trying new types of things in that realm. From a physical activity standpoint, I think I kind of touched on it earlier, but allowing myself like to chill out and relax a little bit, have some downtime, fully recover, enjoy what I'm doing. But yeah, that can certainly take a toll on you mentally and physically. So I think reaching out to people, using your resources. I know like at Oakland, we do a great job with kind of having these webinars or talks about with our fifth years or fourth years about what they want to do like outside of their sport and separating themselves from that identity that they have as an athlete and really leaning into those new hobbies. But I'm certainly no sports psychologist or therapist, so I will stop there if anyone wants to join.
I know Madison and I had briefly talked about this and Jean earlier when we had talked, but there is this concept of intuitive eating out there, and it certainly is getting a lot more recognition. But I think some of these principles, and Madison's actually touched on a few of them, like finding the joy in movement and healing this relationship with food, which I think can be so beneficial from going from a college athlete to not being that athlete anymore. So yes, I would certainly agree with Madison and what she's saying there. And I think on top of that too, if it is something that, wanting to explore what therapy can look like or sports psychology, there are some specific outlets there as well.
Definitely. Yeah, and I know we've done a lot of mental health work on all of our campuses for student athletes to really make sure they have those resources. So yeah, I mean, I think you guys have talked a lot about, right, your entire sort of routine is going to change, right? Once you kind of stop being a college athlete. So is there any ways, I mean, I think you maybe touched on it a little bit, anything with regards to how you eat, right? Like where I think again, student athletes, you guys have your routines, right? We always eat at this time, we do this, we do this. Is there anything, especially, like I know Madison, you said you just stopped being an athlete that you found helpful to making that transition out of sort of that set routine that you've always had that maybe that's not really going to work. Maybe you have a job now that doesn't allow you to have your lunch every day at 12 o'clock, which you were used to. Right now it's 1 o'clock before you have lunch. Like, are there things that you can really do to sort of help with that transition out?
I think the biggest thing that helped me was planning and preparation. So pretty much from my experience, the hardest part of nutrition, once you like learn what it is, it's the actual time and effort that it takes. So maybe it's actually blocking out half of your Sunday to figure out, okay, I'm going to go to the store. I'm going to make sure I have this available so that I'm not in a pinch and have to then rely on these convenience type foods that maybe I wouldn't have normally done. So for me, I think it's having a plan for myself, once you have a family, for your family, to then be prepared for the week basically on like, okay, I know I have these three things that I can make for breakfast. Here's a few things I can make for lunch, and then plan out a few different dinners. Personally, I don't eat like I don't meal prep and eat the same thing every night. I just can't do that. So I like to find like a few fun recipes for the week and then kind of rotate through those depending on my schedule. And then if I have extra time, I'll cook midweek as well. But I think the time and the preparation has been the best thing for me post being an athlete and now working.
Um, Before I go on to the next question, just a reminder for all of you participants, please feel free if you have a question, throw it in the Q&A, and we'll make sure that our panelists get to it. So another part that we haven't talked about yet, but I've seen several of us taking drinks as we've been going throughout this, hydration, right? So that's, I think, probably just as important for all of us as the food we're eating is making sure we're staying hydrated. So how does hydration really sort of change post athletics? I'm assuming it changes a little, right? Because you're not sweating all of that water back out of your body. And so should they be changing how they're taking in fluids, right? Is it more water? Is it less water, more electrolytes, herbal teas? Like, how does hydration really look for them, sort of post athletics? Who wants to start?
Well, I'll start. Probably their hydration needs will be decreased as a result of their not having the same amount of physical activity, and they're not losing a lot of fluids while they're working out. But I mean, it just really all depends on what that physical activity looks like post college, and having a variety of fluids to drink from. Like, we talk to athletes about when to have what type of fluid. They might not be as restricted once their college career is over and they're moving on to, maybe an office type job, or they may be more free to drink what they want as far as different types of fluids. But, there are things that are healthier than others. And I think that for the most part, unless somebody is sweating a lot through physical activity, they probably could get their electrolytes from food versus they need a sports drink to have that. So I don't usually believe that somebody who's not participating in athletics needs to drink a Gatorade or Powerade or that sort of thing. But we see that, right? We do see people that are walking around with those types of things. So, there's different benefits of all different types of beverages, smoothies, herbal teas, coffee even. So, talking about what's best at what time and so on, and is really individualized.
I'm going to piggyback off that real quick.
Sure.
I was going to say too, is especially with like some of the sports drinks that we're talking about, like, Gatorade, Powerade, some of those types of things, reading nutrition labels could be a great way to educate yourself on nutrition as well. And I think many people don't know how to read a nutrition label. So again, a good opportunity to learn something new, read through what you're seeing on there. Every time I discuss, nutrition labels, I'll ask somebody, what do your eyes go to first? Is it calories? Is it sugars? Is there a specific component that we're looking at? So I think educating on, what types of things are more beneficial in certain situations, kind of like Jean had mentioned there, is huge too.
So we do have a bunch of questions now in the Q&A, so that's exciting. We'll just kind of take them in order here. So what are some good breakfast options for when you have those early 6, 7 a.m. practices? So any thoughts on something good for breakfast?
I can touch on that a little bit. So, I think this is a great topic to talk about with athletes because everyone's fueling looks so different. In general, when we think about pre-workout nutrition or pre-exercise nutrition, we do want to focus on items that digest really easy. We want to try to avoid, any sort of upset stomach. So generally that looks like our easy digestible carbohydrates. So generally in that carbohydrate section there, we've got our really easy to digest carbohydrates, and we've got more of our complex carbohydrates. Those might be more of like your whole grain sources. Your simple or easy to digest carbohydrates can look like many different things. That can look like my runners really like the squeezy applesauce pouches. They think that works really well for them. I have some athletes that will have a few Cheez-Its or pretzels beforehand. I have athletes that tell me, I really don't feel good if I have anything beforehand, wherein I'll push back on that a little bit and I'll say, maybe this is an opportunity for us to have a few sips of a Gatorade, a Powerade, more of those regular types of things, because again, those simple sugars digest really, really quick. So especially if there's not a lot of time before exercise, gravitating towards those easy digestible carbohydrates can be good options before exercise.
I think that's such a good point, because a lot of times we hear this, that our athletes have to get up and leave really early and they don't have a lot of time. And, they'd rather wait till after practice to eat. But if they get a little bit of fuel in before they leave their room or their apartment, whatever the case may be, it's going to help fuel their activity. hydrate, and all of those things that are important for pre-exercise.
Yeah. Yeah, that's good. It's good for me. I'm a sleep until the very last minute person, so good to know as I'm heading out the door as well. The next question out here, thoughts on kombucha? I don't know, good, bad, not really sure. Any thoughts?
Well, I don't know if my colleagues here want to answer, but what I would say is having foods that are a source of probiotic can help your gut and decrease inflammation, and that's really important. So kombucha is one of those foods that is fermented, so it's a source of probiotics. And so anyways, anybody else want to weigh in on that?
I would say the same thing. I think as far as like products in general, kind of going back to reading nutrition labels is really big because, just because you're seeing something that, it might be a kombucha and it might be labeled with probiotics doesn't mean that there's extra things that they're adding into that product, like extra added sugars. So just reading through nutrition labels is huge, but, especially with probiotics and gut health, that's one that we're going to continue to research for a long time because everybody's gut microbiome is so different. So in general, very great sources to include in your diet.
Let's see, next one. Hang on. The question moved on me, sorry. Do you think taking multivitamins is important in addition to healthy eating? Okay.
I would say, for the most part, if you feel like you are getting a very well-rounded diet with lots of colorful things, lean proteins, whole grains, every single day, you're probably just fine without one. If you know that that's not the case and you're often running on coffee and skipping meals and convenience items, then it's certainly not going to hurt anything. So basically, if you already are eating a fairly well-rounded diet and you're getting those extra multivitamins, you're just going to excrete that in the urine. So it's not like it's going to hurt anything. I just say sometimes that you have very expensive urine if you're taking a multivitamin and getting them in food as well. So I'm always going to say get it first in your food. Your body uses that and likes that a lot better, but it's certainly going to be a helpful substitution if you can't do that.
Is there I'm going to ask my own follow-up to this one. Is there anything in particular you should look in multivitamins? I know like when you go to the store, there's an entire aisle that is nothing but multivitamins. Is there something that they should be looking for, especially as athletes, when they're looking at sort of those different multivitamins?
One of the things that I would recommend is that looking on the label and looking for 100% of the RDA, which is the recommended dietary allowance. So sometimes people think, well, if 100% is good, I'm going to try 2000%, and that's not necessarily better. So they're either going to excrete that in their urine, or if it's something that's stored in the body, it could actually be beyond the upper limit that's been studied for that particular nutrient. So, I always like to tell people to look for something that has been maybe had some independent testing by Consumer Lab, or there's an organization called NSF that you can actually scan the barcode on the product, and they will, you'll see if that product has been studied or if there's any safety issues possibly with it. So we know that a lot of people take supplements, whether it's multivitamin or something else, and the FDA is unable to really regulate all of that because of the amount of supplements there are on the market. So we want people to be as safe as possible and look for things that maybe have been produced in a facility that has good manufacturing practices so that we can be as safe as possible with those types of things.
And that's where I'm going to throw on my compliance hat for a second and remind them, because they are not regulated, you don't necessarily know what's in them. So from an NCAA drug testing standpoint, you could take something that doesn't have it on the label, but you can still end up with a positive NCAA drug test. So just always be very, very cautious about what you're taking as far as supplements and protein powders and those types of things. Just you really try to be careful because saying that I didn't know does not usually work with the NCA. So just I'll take my compliance hat back off now. So yeah, we'll go on. We've got several more questions. Next one, what is the general perception of intermittent fasting to dietitians? Is it ever a top recommendation for certain clients? Any thoughts on intermittent fasting?
I was
It's
going
a
to
good
say,
question.
yeah, I was going to say that is a really good question because from an athlete perspective, it's not something that I recommend for my athletes. It because of the needs, the energy needs that you need throughout the day, putting a time limit on there just creates a lot more stress, tends to create a lot more stress on your GI tract. You end up not getting enough in throughout the day. So it does give I guess, yeah, makes a little bit of a barrier there. With other patients, or, I guess if we're thinking post-athletic career, um, for some people, intermittent fasting can hold them to that schedule that maybe some people need, especially if we are seeing that somebody needs help with that cutoff time, that maybe they find themselves snacking late into the evening. Having a time to shoot for maybe can be beneficial as far as hey, oh, it's getting a little bit close to bedtime, maybe it's time for me to wind down. But I would say it's not helpful in every case. I would say it's a case by case basis in terms of how I typically would recommend it to patients. I don't know if Jean or Madison would agree with that.
Well, I totally agree that is it the best thing for athletes when they might be expending quite a bit of energy and stored carbohydrate, just getting up and going to class so that by the time they get to their exercise portion of their day, whether it's the weight training or the practice, the 2 or 3 hour practice, they've used a lot of their fuel and they haven't taken any in or replaced what they've used. So by the time they get to that physical activity portion of their day, they're really low on fuel, it seems. So I can't imagine a situation where it would be beneficial as far as in athletics. And I think that the evidence goes back and forth about, does it help an individual with diabetes, not an athlete, but somebody? Does it help people with hypertension? And I think we have pros and cons. So I think the jury's out on it. But I can't really see how it would benefit an athlete.
Yeah. All right. Next question. How much protein carbs is recommended to intake directly after a workout?
Great question. So generally there's a ratio that we look at post workout. So carbs to protein, we look at a 3-to-1 ratio generally. It can look a little bit different depending on what the goals are, but especially if it's a very hard season of training, we're looking at a 3-to-1 ratio. So carbs 3, protein 1. So let's say, for example, you're getting, 30 grams of protein in your post-workout meal, which could look like, if we're looking at food, I use the example, I'm sure Jean and Madison use this as well, but palm of your hand is that source of protein. That's going to be anywhere from 25 to 30 grams of protein there. So if we're getting that amount of protein, we got to multiply that by 3 to get the amount of carbohydrates that we need, which would equal out to 1.5 to 2 cups of that carbohydrate source, that rice, pasta, potatoes, whatever that looks like there.
I think another thing to add is getting that recovery within that 30 to 60-minute window so that we can start the recovery process as soon as possible. When you're exercising, you're tearing down your muscles, using your energy stores, and to rebuild them back stronger, bigger, faster, we need to do that with nutrition. So getting that fuel that we just talked about within that 30 to 60-minute window, or as soon as possible, really, would be the best recommendation.
Great. Oh, this one's a longer one. So it says, I'm a distance runner and a member of our cross country team. And a lot of my teammates, as well as myself, have incredibly sensitive stomachs and can't eat basically all day if we're competing in the evening. How do you train yourself to be able to properly fuel before something like a 10K, where if the nutrition goes wrong, it can really be catastrophic?
I think that a lot of athletes experience that on days of competition. And so, if they are unable to take solid food, could they take smaller amounts of liquids that have carbohydrate in them that could be providing a source of fuel so that they're not burning through their stored fuel that they need for later on during that event? And, with a focus on carbohydrate, maybe smaller meals spaced out throughout the day so that it's not a lot of food at one time, of easily digested, a lot of carbohydrate. So fruit juice, a smoothie, sports beverage, things like that, if that's the case. If they want to try something solid like some saltines, things that might be easily digested, and space those out through the day, um, that would help so that they're not going into that race already depleted of whatever stored fuel they had.
I think too, I give the example of, training for your race, you need to train for your nutrition as well. So kind of piggybacking off that as well, finding things that work for you is important and trying not to choose, different items on race day, especially if, there's certain items that work really well for you, try to stick with those things, try not to experiment too much because if you're already stressed out, adding something new to your body that your body's not recognizing normally, it tends to not lead to good results there either.
Yeah, I agree with both of that. And just a third thing is if you're doing what we just said with the small, consistent meals, choosing really bland things, relying on what you've done throughout practice, and it's still like you can't hold anything down, then I think reaching out to some sort of like sports psychology or something to work on that performance anxiety would be super beneficial because the physical and mental health are super, super correlated, especially for runners. You probably have experience if you're a runner, you know that that anxiety is not going to help anything in your GI tract.
Good. It's another reason for me to not run a 10K. All right. How do you feel about drinking coconut water as a way to get electrolytes before competition if you aren't a fan of all the sugar in drinks such as Gatorade? Thoughts?
I guess, yeah. So, I mean, it can be a source of electrolytes. The only thing that I point out, especially with like Gatorade and Powerade, like Jean had mentioned, all those things do have a place. So, how I talk about carbohydrates with my athlete is I always say, think of your body like a car. We got to put gas in the car to go. That gas that we're putting in there are those carbohydrates. So when we think about those simple carbohydrates, we're just topping off the tank. So if we're getting some of those carbohydrates in, especially through some of those like Gatorade, Powerades, those types of things, more of like those sugary beverages before exercise, perfectly fine. I would think as far as like coconut water, it might be more beneficial as maybe that electrolyte replacement after exercise or even leading up until exercise. So I would say it could go either way. As far as that, you might be missing a little bit more of that sodium content. So again, reading through that nutrition label to get a balance of those electrolytes would be a big one.
Okay. Another so this one a little bit. Well, I'm gonna skip this one and come back to it. I'm gonna go to another one because it's this one is a little off topic. But are there benefits in taking creatine as an athlete? And what about for a post-student athlete career?
I think that creatine is probably the most widely studied supplement. And so much so that, I mean, I won't say how long I've been in this field, but a long time. And, I've seen an evolution in the acceptance of creatine, where at first, when it first came on the scene, there was a lot of skepticism about it. Is this really beneficial? Who's it beneficial for? How should people be taking it? And so on. And I think that we've seen a lot of studies, probably the most widely studied. So I think that there's a lot of evidence that supports its use. And even for a non-athletic community, I think we're seeing studies that it may be beneficial in brain health and for people who are not athletic. And so there may be possible uses for it beyond athletics, I'll just say.
I would second all of that. I think it can certainly be useful throughout many populations, ages. So, yes.
Okay. All right. Again, just a reminder, be careful when you're taking these things as a student athlete. We don't want anybody ending up with an NCAA positive banned substance test. So the last question we have on here, and again, we've got more time, so those of you listening, if you have additional questions, please feel free to drop them in the Q&A. Any tips for our student athletes who may want to become a future sports nutritionist? Anything you can give them as sort of advice for a career path?
I think Madison should go first.
I would say don't be afraid to shoot your shot or reach out or ask questions or ask to volunteer. I currently have, I don't know if she's on the call or not, but I currently have a student intern that's working with me this year who's a nutrition student, also an athlete. And I think it was just, hey, like, do you have any opportunities here? And I did the same as an athlete in Florida. I worked with the football team as their dietetic intern, just getting as much experience, hands-on things, mentorship that you can. I think it's a very tight-knit community of sports dietitians that I've continued to learn and see. So in one group that you're in, it's going to cross over with another, and there's going to be a lot of connection. So I think my biggest advice would just be reach out, see if you can help, see if you can ask and get some things on your resume and also learn some things too.
And I think there's been tremendous growth in this field from maybe not every team having a sports dietitian or access. And, you know, from the collegiate level to the professional level, almost every team and school has a sports dietitian. And so I think that if somebody's worried, will I be able to find a job? I think that there's lots of opportunities if that's something that somebody is really interested in. And then they have all that firsthand experience as an athlete themselves. And I think that that's really important and relatable when you're working with athletes and individuals.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that too. How exciting if you're actually considering that. That's awesome. I would certainly agree with both Jean and Madison. You know, any sort of experience that you can get is awesome. You know, even if it feels really small, you know, that's still something that you can use in the future. I was just thinking about this a few weeks ago, but you know, 5 years ago, I graduated from my undergrad, and now I'm a sports dietitian, and everything like blinked before my eyes. Like, I don't know how I got to this position, but it goes fast. So, you know, if that is something that you're serious about and something that seems really interesting to you, you know, just even starting to learn about it.
Obviously, as student athletes are going out, right? We've talked to before when they're on road trips and that they don't really get the choices a lot of times of where they're eating. So once they are able to make that choice, any thoughts on how to pick a restaurant that maybe has some healthier options? Because right now, right, either coach is making the choice or we're probably tending towards the fast food late at night, what's ever open. But any thoughts on restaurant selection as you're going out and living that non-athlete life?
Yeah, I'll jump in on this one. Whenever I teach the athlete's plate of carbs, protein, and color, I do that so they can use that wherever they are. So if they're at the dining hall, if they're at Chick-fil-A, if they're at McDonald's, if wherever, think about those things. So getting some source of carb on your plate, some source of protein, and some source of color. So if you're at Chick-fil-A, maybe it's getting a side salad or a fruit cup with your chicken sandwich and fries. If it's at Chipotle, can we add some lettuce on there or some tomatoes? We can get creative with our colors. And if it's somewhere that you truly like, you can't find those things, for one, you're going to be okay. But for two, maybe you grab a banana when you get home or have some sort of color later on afterwards. So I always say just focus on adding an extra colorful thing, getting enough protein, and you can truly do that wherever. I promise you, even McDonald's has colorful things on the menu.
Definitely agree with that. And I think to Madison's point too is focusing on adding to versus taking away. I think that's also a huge concept too. If we're trying to keep this positive relationship with food, is adding to what you're having. Especially if there are things that you are going somewhere, Chick-fil-A for example, and you really want a certain thing. Can we add that fruit cup or that side salad? Whatever that is there. I think that's also huge.
Great. All right. We've got a few more minutes here, so I'll get a couple more questions. Oh, it looks like we got another one. Yeah, this one again, it's about like protein powders and finding some that maybe aren't as expensive. Again, gonna very, very much caution using those things while you are a student athlete. Just because again, you very, very likely we could end up with an NCAA banned substance positive test if you're using those things. But any thoughts, like if somebody does, so let's say we transition into that post-athlete life, right? So not as a current student athlete, and you want to use some of those supplements. Any suggestions again on places to go find those, maybe ones that are affordable, reliable, right? Safer, as safe as they can be again, since they're not very really regulated. Any thoughts on that?
Well, first of all, one of the questions I like to ask is why do they think they need it? So tell me a little bit about your diet, and so we can kind of estimate, are they meeting their protein needs, or does their diet really need some work? Are there ways that they could improve that with food? Because a lot of times you're getting other nutrients in foods that contain protein that you might not necessarily be getting in a supplement form. For example, a lot of meat is very high in iron as well. You're not always getting that in a supplement. And that's just one example. But, I like to use an app that you scan the barcode on the NSF for Sport app. You scan the barcode and you can tell if this supplement has been studied. Is it proven to be safe? And, there are things that probably are safer than others. So even if it's not going to be a positive test or a violation with the NCAA, we want people to be safe and healthy. So, making sure that we see these indications on the label, that it was, tested for good manufacturing practices or consumer labs, those types of things are, I think, important.
Yeah, and I could just, share, I'll just real quick experience. I had a student athlete at an institution I worked at who did use a protein powder and did end up with an NCAA positive test. And what they tested positive for was not something that was on the label. And it was actually something that when we got to looking into it has been known to cause cancer. So again, just be very, very careful when you're using these things. And I think this is a lot of good advice. One of the other questions I had is, so as we're talking about, again, we've done a lot of talk about this transition sort of out of athletics, out of being an athlete. What are some hardships that maybe you've either encountered as a former athlete or have seen some of the athletes you've worked with as they make that transition sort of out of competition? And is there anything that you maybe tell your athletes or that you as an athlete would have liked to have known as you're making that transition out that could be helpful for our student athletes listening?
I think one thing that's helpful still sort of on a nutrition realm is budgeting for like groceries specifically. I think I wish I would have learned more about that. Now exploring Aldi and figuring out how cheap that can be while still getting such great products. So I would say like from a life perspective, I know we already touched on a lot of the other transitional things, so I'll shift to the money side of things and kind of choosing things that are in season versus out of season. Season's going to be a little bit cheaper. Shopping the perimeter, having a list before you go grocery shopping can be helpful. Don't show up when you're super hungry and irrational or hangry. So I think having a plan going into it is always really beneficial from a budgeting perspective. I don't know if there's any other topics that we haven't talked about that you guys want to join in on.
I think visit your local farmers market. I mean, it's not the season yet here, anyways, but that's when you're going to get the most fresh food, locally grown, and maybe even organic without a lot of pesticides or so on. And I think that's always a good option. And people might be surprised how affordable that is. But you mentioned something, Madison, about planning. And I think that that's something that maybe a student athlete doesn't have to do a lot of because a lot of those things are taken care of. There's a meal provided for them, or they're choosing their meals in their dorm. But once that is taken away, they're not having that. They can start planning and finding out what they like, or if they like to cook, or different things like that. Looking at recipes, whether it's on Instagram or in a cookbook or whatever, to find out what they like. Maybe they actually like to prepare food. So there's still a lot to learn once their collegiate athletic career is coming to an end, and they might find that they enjoy that. But planning, and sometimes it's preparing meals in advance, because even though they don't have the athletic side as far as college goes, they may have a career, a family eventually, and get very busy. So planning can be beneficial.
I would say too, even well, yeah, for personal experience, I don't love to cook. So I'm sure there's some of you out there too that probably don't love to cook or maybe don't know how to cook. So I think another opportunity to learn something new. My dad always says this quote, if you always wear blue pants, you'll never know how you feel in pink pants. It just kind of quote saying, get out of your comfort zone, do something new, see how you feel with that. And if that's taking a cooking class with, by yourself or with friends, it gives you an opportunity to learn some new skills too.
Awesome. Well, we are almost out of time, so we're going to sort of end it with, obviously, you guys have given our student athletes a ton of information. This was fabulous. Again, we'll put the recording out to everybody. But obviously, there probably are still more questions, right? I'm sure there are somebody who didn't want to ask their question now, somebody who can join us to ask a question. So obviously they have a lot of you on campus, right? They can always reach out to you if you work with their campus. Some of our other campuses I know have nutritionists as well, or their athletic trainers, right? Can usually help them in this area. Are there other resources though that you all would recommend, whether maybe online, books, anything like that you think are good resources kind of in this space of nutrition that our athletes should keep in mind moving forward?
So many. But I think the NCAA has a website with a lot of nutrition information on it. So that's one place. There's the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics. There is, some of you might remember Nancy Clark probably was the first person to write a book about sports nutrition that everybody could read. And I don't know what volume or edition she's on right now, but super easy to read. And I think everybody would enjoy that book, whether you're a nutritionist or not.
All right. Well, great. Thank you guys so much. We really appreciate it. We know our student athletes appreciate it. All of you that attended, we appreciate you being here this evening and asking a lot of really great questions. I think it made this really worthwhile. So thank you all again. And yeah, have a good evening, everyone.